There's nothing natural about segregation. It is the result of past and current conscious public policies. Until people begin to understand that race and class segregation is a result of intentional choices, current day choices even, I think they're less likely to be outraged.
This is not a sectional issue. Difficulties over segregation and discrimination exist in every city, in every state of the Union, producing in many cities a rising tide of discontent that threatens the public safety. It is better to settle these matters in the courts than on the streets, and new laws are needed at every level. But law alone cannot make men see right.
After the civil rights movement rocked the American South, steps to integrate schools and housing in the northern United States met with less clear success, but still with fierce resistance. Welcome to Yonkers, New York, population 196,000. This city, located to the north of New York's Bronx, sits on the Hudson River and enjoys a view of the Palisades Cliffs across the Hudson's west bank. Residents of Yonkers work hard, living in many neighborhoods, ranging from comfortable to simple. They're proud of their community and of its long history.
Yonkers' case was really a throwback to the 60s, to where you could pinpoint deliberate government action having created the segregation. There were about 4 areas where blacks lived: the Runyon Heights community, Ashburton, Warburton area, Cottage Place. Basically, that was the black community. Well, I grew up in Runyon Heights. It was easy to market to people in Harlem, and the train came straight up here, and they used to have picnics, and that's how they bought the land.
This area, the only African-American neighborhood in East Yonkers, was sealed off from surrounding neighborhoods by a 10-foot strip of land around it, originally fenced, that was purchased by the adjoining white community of Homefield to isolate Runyon Heights from its neighbors.
The developers of the two properties intended one to be black and the other one to be white, and this is Homefield over here. This is a strip of land that separates the two neighborhoods and causes every street to end in a dead end. I went to Longfellow Junior High School. The discrimination I faced was primarily in the counseling process. Although I wanted to go to college as a junior high school student, I was steered to a commercial high school, eventually to a retailing program. The original efforts was to try to get me into a foods trades program.
Winston Ross sent a letter to the Board of Education stating that there was concern of the branch with racial isolation in the Yonkers school system.
Angelo Martinelli ran for mayor at the time on a platform of opposing Board of Education members who wanted to work with the local NAACP.
I came from the NAACP. You can bet your bottom dollar that I didn't think too much of it. I thought they were asking for the moon. It took a while for me to really take a more moderate position. But the first 5 or 6 years, I was a bull in a china shop, and I'm willing to admit it.
A school task force studied Yonkers' racial divide, but its findings were dismissed.
We had no other option but to go to the federal agencies. There was an investigation done. They agreed with our claim. Board of Ed, categorically, we're not guilty. We have not done anything wrong. Take us to court.
We lived in the Bronx, and I'd always lived in an apartment my whole life. We always lived in nice neighborhoods, and we always had very nice apartments. But when the chance came to move up to Yonkers, that was great. I lived upstairs in my brother-in-law's animal hospital. I worked for him. It was a nice place to be. But once you get into a neighborhood and you really want to be part of the neighborhood, you don't really want to be the family that lives at the animal hospital, and you start to notice how pretty it is and you wish that you could live there. I always said, I want a house, a brick house on St. John's Avenue, or I don't want a house. And one snowy day, my daughter and I were driving up St. John's Avenue, and this house had a for sale sign. We got along with the family who lived here. He shook hands, and that's how we bought the house. You know, they made us feel so welcome. We just thought they were wonderful. It's a great memory, and it's a great house. So when the school integration thing came about, I said, I'm not really worried because it's not going to happen here, not in my neighborhood.
When we moved here, I was starting my doctoral program. I was starting a doctoral program. Gene would go to work. Gene was at one of those law firms that worked him to death.
We have a surname that is Italian in origin. We called this real estate agent who, sight unseen, said to us, well, if you want to live in Yonkers, you want to live east of the Bronx River Parkway. We didn't know anything about Yonkers, so we said, is that right? And she said, yes, that's where you want to live. But when we started looking at houses in the area, started going to real estate agents, they generally took us to only certain areas. What we did see was all located in the southwest area. We had this feeling that we weren't seeing all of Yonkers, and that was very clear once we moved to Yonkers and found how much of Yonkers we never saw.
As the attorneys began to investigate, it became clear that there was discrimination in education and segregation that had gone on in this period of time. Housing played a major role in that.
In fact, Yonkers had built 7,000 low-income apartments over 40 years, 99% of them in a 1 square mile area that welcomed African American and Hispanic people. A city-built ghetto grew up in downtown Southwest Yonkers. Every attempt to build public housing elsewhere in the city was rejected. The neighborhood school system reflected the city's sharp racial divide.
What happened is that when they built all this housing, and the housing then became 95% minority, well, the schools, you went to the neighborhood school, and the schools became 95% minority. And consequently, that became the lawsuit.
Where you live defines what schools you'll have access to, whether you'll be exposed to a host of models of success, what networks you will have access to. Often it defines what employers you will have access to. Where you live structures opportunity more than a lot of people realize.
The City of Yonkers, New York, was slapped with an unprecedented lawsuit today. The Justice Department charged that in both its schools and its housing, that city has deliberately set a pattern of racial segregation.
I thought it was unfair. I thought that the parameters of it, which would said that we had discriminated in housing by building all the housing on the west side of Yonkers, the low-income housing, and not putting it onto the east side of Yonkers, was really was not true.
That's the funny part about it. It was built for white people. The vast majority of these projects were built for white people. And they put it there because they wanted them to be near the mills. And now we're heinous racists for doing it. And it's just blatantly unfair. Situations changed. Our factories left. We still help those who couldn't help themselves. I mean, now it's predominantly minority, broken families, but we are giving them a place to live. And at some expense to ourselves. I mean, we have to absorb the social services that come from having people like that down there.
Just because I live in low-income housing does not mean that I am a low person. And I resent the fact that all people of low income are thought of this way. We are proud people, just as these people are proud as homeowners.
We moved a lot because my mother was being abused by her partners. Peekskill, Osland, back to Peekskill, Yorktown, Mount Kisco, Bedford Hills, Golden Bridge, Katona. I don't know, I think Chappaqua, Yonkers, now we're in Yonkers.
In Yonkers, people of color who needed low-cost housing had literally no place to go but downtown.
They call it the hole, because that's what it looks like. You have to drive down into Slowbone. I think it was like 800 and something families with 1,400 kids.
Miss Niecy, how you doing, Breakboard?
As the federal lawsuit moved forward, the Yonkers NAACP wanted a role as co-plaintiff.
You know, we had a fantastic attorney assigned to us by the National Office of NAACP, Michael Sussman.
He was committed to these kinds of cases, otherwise he wouldn't have gone to work for the National Office of the NAACP. He did develop a certain commitment to the city, feeling that he could make a difference in what happened in one community.
It was very plain that there had been a history of systematic exclusion of racial minorities from large portions of the city. I mean, minorities had essentially been fenced out of it. So it very quickly became apparent to me that there was something here about race.
We asked the court to allow us to become co-plaintiff in the case because we didn't have that much faith in where the Reagan administration was going to take justice in this particular case.
There was a stark difference between the Carter administration's housing enforcement, anti-discrimination enforcement, and the Reagan. During the Carter years, the Civil Rights Division at the Justice Department would bring 30 or more cases a year involving housing and desegregation. The Reagan Justice Department brought 0 cases. The implicit message of the Reagan administration was discrimination is okay or it doesn't exist.
The Then Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, William Bradford Reynolds, had an assistant named D'Agostino. And D'Agostino didn't want the case to continue, but he wrote a very, very impertinent memorandum, which people at that time thought was racist.
Blacks, because of their family, cultural, and economic background, are more disruptive in the classroom.
And it caused a galvanization of all the civil rights groups who wanted that case to continue and said, this is the kind of thinking that's going to purge you of this case, this kind of racist thinking. And in response to that, the Justice Department essentially had no choice but to continue the case.
We treated Yonkers as a bedroom community for the first few years that we were here. We commuted to work and lived here. So we were really New York City transplants and spent much of our waking hours there anyway. I read about the case in the paper, even though I knew it involved Yonkers, the city we lived in. We really didn't pay much attention to it. I just assumed that the case was going to be decided the right way, and that if there was intentional segregation, the court would fix it.
I had no clue that this was going on in Yonkers. I had no clue whatsoever. I mean, I thought, that's where the cheapest places were to live, I had no clue they didn't want us in those areas.
When the housing came up, I didn't even pay attention to it. I said, well, I don't have to worry in my neighborhood because Lincoln Park Taxpayers is our group and they are very powerful. It can't happen here. And I sort of went home and I stayed there for a few years because it's not going to happen here.
The trial started in August of 1983.
Here, and what I think you're going to see is a question.
There were people from the media there. There were lots of people from the community there that first day.
We represent the larger number. No, I
remember being there by myself with a couple lawyers from the government.
Ken Barnes was one of the Justice Department's two lead attorneys in the case.
One of the important things about this case is that it demonstrated factually, by proof and by court findings, that a lot of these arguments that are made against low-income housing are in fact pretexts for racial opposition. If you look at the census data for the tracts in Southeast Yonkers, where the most virulent opposition is located, the income rates are very, very low there. The income of the minorities who they're afraid would move into their neighborhoods in subsidized housing is not that different from the income of the people that actually live in Southeast Yonkers. White people in East Yonkers didn't want Blacks and Hispanics living in their neighborhoods and going to their schools.
I delivered newspapers to Blacks, but I can't live next to what the government has in these projects. If the government wants to put criminals, dope pushers and things into the projects, I can't live next to them.
In a city where 7,000 units of low-income housing were plopped into a 1 square mile block, creating a Black ghetto, rationalizes fear and loathing of Black people. So people will get these stereotypes of, Black people do drugs, they have babies, they're on welfare, blah, 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 all this stuff, because of these terrible public policy choices that create this milieu.
I really wanted to get out of there when they were having a shootout outside. And Michael ran right in the middle of the gunfire. You're screaming out the window to tell somebody to bring him upstairs. They're not even watching. The gun was not even 2 inches from his head. If the guy would have pulled the trigger at that time, Michael wouldn't be here today. It's time to make a change. Hopefully before my children have children, somebody will wake up and say that, look, this has got to stop.
For the individuals who needed the housing and wanted the housing, there was a feeling that they didn't really believe it would ever happen. There was always a clash between, do we get it done or do we wait for there to be greater acceptance? And I would have erred on the side, certainly, of getting it done.
Judge Leonard Sand called for a break in the trial in 1983 in order to allow the parties to come to an agreement.
And we started a period that ended up lasting about 8 months of alleged mediation. Truth be told, the City of Yonkers never in good faith participated in any of that. On housing issues, there was no negotiation in that 8-month period, nothing. The only thing productive eventually that came from that period was the settlement with HUD.
The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development agreed to settle their part of the case by building 200 units of low-income housing outside of downtown, if the City Council provided the land.
Any settlement had to be approved by the City Council in Yonkers. Any settlement had to be basically authorized by the mayor. There was not only no will to do it, there was a rebelliousness, a contumaciousness, a scornfulness.
They could have taken on whatever opposition there was at that point and turned it into a progressive catalyst for change. But instead, they chose to turn it into a catalyst for chaos.
A man named William Gibson, part Indian, part African-American, big man, was a leading member of the Citizen Advisory Committee and one of the witnesses in the trial. And Gibson explained what he was doing at the Urban Development Corporation and how they went around the city and found appropriate sites. The city was trying to show that the minority community welcomed the housing in Southwest Yonkers. So he's being cross-examined by the city lawyer. Well, isn't it a fact that you wanted the sites there? Didn't you eventually support them? And Gibson looks kind of down. And he says, when a man has no shoes, somebody offers him half a shoe, he puts half a shoe on his foot.
Judge Sand said that he wanted to see Yonkers firsthand. So he invited all counsel, all lawyers for all sides to come along with him. We went around in a little van and showed him what East Yonkers was like, West Yonkers was like. I pointed out some of the larger streets on the east side with huge multifamily apartment buildings all over to demonstrate the east side was not a suburban single-family home area. We looked at various schools, modern, well-appointed schools on the east side, and the dilapidated, really deteriorating schools in Southwest Yonkers.
The racism in that city was being exposed. The tremendous double standards in schools and housing, the steering of black children, however bright they might be, to general classes, which had been a tremendous historical pattern in Yonkers. We were exposing it all.
Upon resuming, the trial of U.S. versus Yonkers took up most of 1983 and 1984, with 93 days of testimony by 83 witnesses, 140 depositions, and thousands of exhibits presented in court.
The evidence was incredible, and the Yonkers lawyers knew it. Nobody was, playing games. They knew what was going on in that courtroom. They were getting killed. The decision was rendered on November 20th, 1985 by Judge Sand. It was probably the longest decision in a civil rights case in American legal history.
It was a 600-page document. He said that for 40 years, the City of Yonkers and the Board of Education had purposely and intended to segregate the minority community. And this is a landmark decision. People should understand this. Akin to Brown versus Topeka, Kansas, 1954.
It represented the joining of housing and school claims and the holding of the municipality, the City of Yonkers, liable for school segregation, saying to the municipality that if you maintain and ensure segregated housing patterns intentionally, the consequent school segregation will be at your doorstep as well. The court had never said that before.
Once the decision was reached, the Board of Education agreed to a remedy. It was a difficult task to design a complete new educational system that would bring about racial integration. The main focus of the plan was the magnet school concept. Most of your 30-some schools had specialized curriculums, arts and science, computers, dance and drama, so as to attract youngsters from all over the city. And it's worked because you had a different kind of leadership. The housing piece is another story.
Most other communities would choose to negotiate a settlement, but the City of Yonkers chose to fight on.
Well, it was feeling powerless as a citizen. No judge should be allowed to do this. People talked about property values, that they were going to go down. And I just love it here so much. And I just had this vision of low-income housing coming in because I knew what the west side of town looked like. I didn't know any of the people over there. It had nothing to do with the people. I just had this vision of everything that we worked so hard for going down the tubes. And then you find out that Lincoln Park taxpayers can't do a darn thing for you. Believe it or not, I was the shyest person in the world. You know, I knew my friends and I knew my neighbors, but I would never, ever speak in public or wouldn't even think of it. I started to meet people. People started to call me up. I went to Save Yonkers. We joined that. We met Spallone, and that's how we really got involved.
I watched the Bronx die with the programs they're trying to give Yonkers, and I'm not going to support any of those programs. And I will continue to do as much as I can to fight them kinds of ideas that only lead to destruction of the city.
And so many of us on the council believe this decision should be reversed. We want an appeal. We want to be heard on another level.
There was a vote for an appeal, I believe, in the spring of '86. We had delayed it at that time 5 years. If we could will an appeal, we could certainly buy time.
Appeals by the city of the 1985 ruling kept the housing order from being enforced through 1986 and 1987.
Let's tell this judge to go to hell.
I saw some councilmen, to me, who were demagogues. They would go out and they whipped up people. We're going to win this case and we're going to fight it all the way to the Supreme Court.
Justice, no peace.
There's a lot of genuine anger of the people out there, and they wanted us to fight it.
But one of the things I will push for is elections of judges. No more gods sit on benches.
The people who led the opposition were very clever because they had taken over the framing of the issue. And for a long time now, they had framed the issue around the judge.
Judge Sam eventually appointed Oscar Newman. And Oscar Newman was a housing expert, a planning expert, and his job was to help implement a housing remedy order.
You could close that off. Not only that,
And the monitor came in and convinced the judge that we should not be building high-rise with 100 units at each, or 75 or 80 units at each. What we should be building is clustering townhouses, maybe 30 units in one area, 15 units in another area, 10 units in another. Now, that sounds very good, and it was good. It was really good. The trouble is, if you build 200 units in two sites, you only have to worry about the people that are living around those areas. But when you start to build in units of 25, 15, you start to have 7, 8, 9, 10 different areas. You're getting everybody involved.
I don't approve of that housing. And one of the things that I would absolutely say is that those 7 sites must go. That's been a failure in America since the 1960s.
Judge Sand looks at Yonkers as his toy. He plays with it, and, like a little kid, after he builds up the big Lego bricks or the blocks, he knocks it down and does it over again. Well, that's fine if a kid does that with his blocks, but we have a couple 100,000 people here.
I told people, I think we can do better if we're involved in the settlement rather than having a judge impose the settlement upon us. And in 1987, I lost the election.
Angelo Martinelli, who's a 12-year mayor, lost to virtually a newcomer.
I don't know. It depends. I was attending law school down in the city. The school was not far away from federal court. And sometimes on my lunch breaks or free periods, I would stop in while the trial was in progress. I've gone through Yonkers public schools here, even as a student in high school, noticed the patterns of segregating, especially at the high school level. So I felt the city would probably lose the school portion of the case, and I thought they should lose it. I think that'll be for the better. I think we'll improve our system that way. The housing I was less certain of.
Now you had a new fella coming in with many of the same old council members, Shima, Longo, Spallone, Fagan, and here he was, mayor. What was he going to do?
Many of these city council members have been in office 10 years or more, which is the time during which this litigation has languished. Many of them have built careers and advanced careers on promising their constituency that the public housing or the judge or the federal government or a liability finding would never happen, that the city was innocent and that they would fight this till the death successfully. 4 days before my inauguration as mayor, we got the results of that appeal, and it was a 170-page slam dunk of the city's position. But there's no question that ruling by the appeals court set the stage that the city was liable, is liable, and must comply and desegregate.
The new mayor, young mayor, changed his mind and went to the city council and said to them, "You can't win this case."
With that office in this time comes some responsibilities. We lost the case, and that 200 units of public housing are going to have to
In '88, the council signed a consent decree and agreed to everything that they threw at him. 200 units of housing, 800 units of affordable housing. I was surprised at some of the people who agreed, who were probably one of the most vicious people against this thing. They agreed. I couldn't believe it. I could not believe it.
Southeast Yonkers went nuts. I never had so many death threats in my life in the next 6 months.
You know the old story? Agree to something and it's going to be out of the minds of everybody in 1 week? Didn't happen. It didn't happen.
A handful of black people they're looking to appease.
The city councilmen historically have built up the resentment, the fear, and the anger in their constituents' minds, and now can't possibly do a mid-course correction and face that monster that they've created.
I think we tend to isolate or localize racism to certain geographic areas, let's say, like South Africa or the United States in the South.
Those people that didn't want us in their neighborhoods, the more they protested, the more we didn't get angry, but the more questions we asked and the more information we wanted to know.
This is an issue that hit us where we live and where we send our children to school. Home was a place we came to and we felt safe. Home was a place where we could nurture our children and see them grow. Home had now become a battlefield.
After the housing agreement in January 1988, the Yonkers City Council itself came under siege for 6 months by organized citizen groups. In August, the council finally gave them the fight they wanted.
And while some may call it defiance of a federal court judge, I call it defiance of the ruination of the city. My conscience will not permit me to vote yes.
City Council refused then to adopt an affordable housing ordinance, in which we needed to actually implement the program.
4 of the 7 council members voted against changing the zoning ordinance, which then forced the judge to say that if they did not comply and change the zoning ordinance, the city would be held in contempt.
Well, the City Council now has the opportunity to revote this, pass it, and purge contempt.
The federal court ordered fines against the city, which doubled daily.
After 12 days, it'll be $1 million. After 22 days, it'll wipe out our entire budget.
We continue to be concerned with the future of the city. We're concerned over the fines.
Justice Department and Judge Sand felt very strongly that both bankrupting fines against Yonkers should be imposed, and the individual councilman should be held personally, subject to fines and imprisonment.
Well, I believe that my First Amendment right was violated. I believe I have the freedom to speak.
I felt very strongly that to hold these individual councilmen and to say, you have to vote, and if you don't vote, you will have recriminations, including imprisonment, would make them martyrs, which they were trying to be.
What's your reaction? I have my checkbook here to pay the first day, payable to the court clerk.
Henry Spallones of this world would have a new platform. They were going to be folk heroes. They were opposing a court. They were willing to go to jail. Here again, we have the Ross Barnetts, the Orville Forbuses, the George Wallace of the early 60s, back now in Yonkers, 25 years later.
It became apparent, and I thought important for everybody in Yonkers to get involved once the city went into contempt. I became involved when I heard that one of our councilmen who had supported found in contempt was going to speak to a neighborhood group.
Most of you, I believe, knew what my feelings were on this issue. I didn't hide it before election in any debates.
The way he was treating this meeting, it sounded as if he had a consensus to violate the law. And I wanted to let him know that that was far from true.
When a judge blackmails you and tells you, you'll vote the way I say, or I'll bankrupt the city and put you in jail.
And as I listened to this, I was getting angrier and angrier because I thought at least the few people who had spoken at that point were missing the whole point.
I'm a constituent of yours, Mr. Chima. Unlike the gentleman over here, I don't agree that this is a question of judicial. I do not agree that this is a question of judicial dictatorship. That's a side issue, and it's an issue that's been created by you and your cohorts. The issue here is only one. The issue is race. When the plaintiffs walked in to court years ago, all they had to do is put a map of Yonkers on the table showing the sites, and they made a prima facie case of discrimination. At this point, the city is going down. You're dragging the city with you. The judge isn't, but you are. And my concern is, how do you think we're going to get out of this? If you think the judge is going to change his vote, change anything in the substance of the case now, you're dreaming.
It is my obligation.
People in positions of authority, their primary obligation is to uphold the laws of this country, whether they like them or not. That's their job.
Because it seems to me that too few people on this council have the courage.
Wasisco rose to the occasion. He realized that there are some things that are the right thing to do, and that's what you ought to do, even if it means your political neck.
I'm not happy saying it. I wish I could say something else. Vote in the affirmative of this resolution, which was the removal from contempt.
I had no way of knowing at what time, if ever, the crisis and the spiral toward bankruptcy would be stopped. At any time, the city council could have decided to declare bankruptcy, and the effects of that would have lasted for many years. The city council was willing to pay the fines, but unwilling to make cuts in city expenditures.
So that the $800,000 fine can be paid tomorrow.
Politically, it was difficult for them to face the reality of having to lay off several hundred city employees in order to make this week's fine payment, or to close a library in order to save money to make next week's fine payment.
When you consider the amount of money that's been spent here to stop housing and school desegregation, the money that's being wasted to try to stop the law ought to be used investing in education, ought to be used to pay our teachers better. That's why we reach out for equality of moral leadership, appeal to end the illegal resistance.
From August 2nd, 1988 until September 9, the City Council paid mounting fines rather than end its resistance to the court. The local NAACP decided not to take to the streets, but this didn't slow the increasingly virulent opposition to the housing order.
I will continue to fight, and I will continue to ask you, because I've asked you 1,000 times, and the city manager, I want to know what...
I mean, all over the world, I mean, Yonkers made headlines. I mean, is that what we want? And this city has the greatest potential.
I'm not afraid. I wasn't afraid before, and the people in the audience now are not afraid now. Let's tell them what they think of us.
And here we are, talking about defiance, talking about we will stay the course and we will stand in the way of progress.
Got a call to come to the meeting that particular evening because it appeared that that might be the night that a couple of the councilmen might change their votes and allow the judge to withdraw the contempt citation and stop the fines.
That was a very wild night. The council chambers were pretty well crowded, and we were waiting. And they were going to have the vote, I think, by 12 o'clock. And as we were sitting in the council chambers, people from the city started drifting in.
When we got there, there were, I think, hundreds of people outside, most of whom were opposed to the desegregation orders, as was usually the case.
There were a group of protesters outside, and once they saw that I was a woman of color, they automatically assumed that I was one of those people on welfare. And for me, this was a very emotional night, confronting this woman who accused me of being on welfare. I recall all of the scenes that I saw on TV during the civil rights movement, where you saw Blacks being attacked by dogs, people being hosed down by water. So we didn't know what was going to happen next. We didn't know how this racism was going to manifest itself.
Give me the police commissioner.
At one point, I visualized people coming, and burning crosses in our front yard. That's how bad I thought it was going to get.
Think Nick's going to feel that?
Sure he is.
And what real satisfaction is there to frustrating this remedy? Is not providing broader housing opportunity consistent with any federal or state policy? Of course not. It's contrary to all federal and state policy, but it's been fostered in Yonkers.
It almost seems to me that there are no words even for this. I mean, it's just that bad.
I don't believe that this is happening in Yonkers after all we've gone through. To go through a day like this and a night like this.
Is rendering the judiciary rather impotent by all sorts of resistance and noncompliance a goal of a constitutional system? No.
I just don't want to spend $2 million tonight.
If there were a movement in Yonkers, biracial, triracial, for real social change in Yonkers, this suit would have long since been over.
The pressure on the city was not eliminated by the Supreme Court. And today, sitting before us, the abstract fines have now become a reality.
When Nick Longo began to speak, it was clear that he was finally going to vote to comply.
Because of the fines, because of the layoffs,
It was a better plan
we
before you.
have no alternative at this point.
We really were listening to history in the making because we were listening to two of the councilmen decide, and perhaps end their political careers by changing their votes.
No-win situation.
Don't do it, Chima.
Mayor Cisco. Aye. Secretary Salon. No. Now we read a line. Aye.
I have 5 ayes and 2 nays. Resolution number 1.
I think out of chaos comes great opportunity for change.
I never thought it would get this bad.
I'm hoping that a few years down the road, this will be looked back upon as the turning point where a whole drift toward a malaise was tolerated for many years. And when this crisis hit, mobilized people to see that change had to come.
Even after Yonkers ended its contempt, the city quietly resisted implementation of the court order, dragging construction of the townhouses out over 4 more years, while electing Hank Spallone as the city's next mayor.
Candidacy for mayor of the city of Yonkers.
In 1992, the first 200 units of low-income housing were finally finished.
For me, the years that had gone by and the resistance did minimize the feelings of satisfaction I had.
These houses were gorgeous, simply gorgeous. Even though when I got there, I was on public assistance, I made it my business to get out of the system. I think mainly that's what everybody wanted to do.
You know, I was in the projects and I moved to the...
I'm in school, college, and I'm learning a lot of things that I should have learned when I was in grade school. You can't segregate the world for the rest of your life.
I was always opposed to what the housing was about, but I was also concerned about the neighborhood. I just wanted to see what kind of people would be coming over here because I live here. I have to make sure that it's going to be as good as it can be. That when I found out I could be involved in that, wow, I could hardly wait. When you go to the new housing sites, kid from low-income housing sees a kid who lives up the street and they say, hi, you want to play? You know, they just took care of it right there. A kid can play with another kid. They don't even have to speak the same language.
Sometime after he lost the election in 1987, Martinelli called Herman. They had been tremendous antagonists. And Angelo apologized. And he said he wanted to try to make a better Yonkers.
That's true.
And try to transcend a lot of the racial polarization that he acknowledged helping create. But I know that from that day on, Angelo softened and things sort of opened a little.
We continue our efforts because we have to. You can't give up on this kind of thing because we won't have won anything. We'll have a very hollow victory, a victory on paper without having the thing that you really fought for, which was some form of equality, some form of equalness of opportunity.
I have a great personal admiration for many of the people who've been in this struggle. Struggling for civil rights has become a lot less fashionable. I still believe, as I always have believed, that this is the defining American issue, and it will remain so until we are able somehow to transcend it.
Yonkers isn't so different from most American cities. In many areas, housing segregation is more pronounced in the 21st century than it was 100 years ago.
If we chose different public policies, we could have an America that, rather than being premised on fear and exclusion, it could be premised, dare I say it, on love and inclusion. We could have a different America, one that benefits everybody. We just have to choose that course.
Father, please hear me. I'm standing on the front line. I'm tired and my spirit is weak. I'm surrounded by landmines. There's an army of self-destruction and despair. They're aiming at all my children. I'm a trooper, Lord, and I'll fight to my death. Won't you shield me, Lord? I'm at my wit's end. I'm standing on the front line. Be my courage and my shelter. Stand beside me. I know I can win. I'm standing on the front line. I am wounded on the inside. Help me fight on. I know I can win. Oh, there's a battle, Lord, killing all in its path, and the enemy is on the inside.